December 12, 1976, Shreveport, Louisiana. The Louisiana Hayride stage where Elvis Presley first became a star 22 years earlier. 3,000 fans packed the municipal auditorium, expecting a typical Elvis show. Glittering jumpsuit, swiveling hips, the familiar repertoire of hits that made him the king of rock and roll. But at 9:47 p.m., something happens that no one in that audience will ever forget. Elvis is midway through Love Me Tender, his voice soft and vulnerable in the spotlight, when suddenly he stops singing. The band continues for a few beats, confused, before trailing off into silence. Elvis walks to the edge of the stage, squinting into the darkness beyond the theater toward the Shreveport Children's Hospital across the street. The crowd murmurs, "Is this another Elvis breakdown, another pill-fueled meltdown that the tabloids love to report?" But then Elvis does something that shocks everyone present. He cups his hands around his mouth and calls out into the night, his voice carrying across the street, "Sweetheart, what's your name?" He's talking to someone on a hospital balcony, a small figure silhouetted against the window, a child. What happens next will cost Elvis $250,000 in lawsuits and refunds. It will destroy his relationship with Colonel Parker forever. It will make headlines across the country as yet another example of Elvis Presley's erratic behavior. But what the world doesn't know, what won't be revealed until decades after Elvis's death, is that this moment represents the most profound transformation of his entire life. A dying 8-year-old girl named Sarah Bate Morgan whispered 3 words that night that would haunt Elvis until his final breath. And those words would change everything about how he saw himself, his fame, and what it truly means to be a father. This is the story the world never heard, the story of how a child's love saved Elvis Presley's soul, even as he couldn't save her life. To understand what happened that night in Shreveport, you have to understand where Elvis was in December of 1976. This wasn't the triumphant king of rock and roll that most people imagined. This was a man slowly drowning in his own success, suffocating under the weight of expectations and isolation that fame had built around him like a prison. Elvis was 41 years old, but he looked older, much older. The prescription pills that he claimed helped him perform were actually stealing pieces of his soul, one dose at a time. His marriage to Priscilla had ended in divorce 3 years earlier, and their daughter Lisa Marie felt more like a stranger than his own flesh and blood. Every 2 weeks, she'd visit Graceland for court-mandated custody time, and Elvis would watch his little girl navigate the chaos of his world with the careful politeness of a guest. She was 9 years old, the same age he'd been when his twin brother Jesse died at birth, a loss that had haunted Elvis his entire life, leaving him with a desperate need to connect that fame had made nearly impossible to fulfill. Colonel Parker, his manager, had become more like a warden than a business partner. Every decision, every relationship, every human connection had to be filtered through the Colonel's calculation of profit and publicity. Elvis hadn't made a meaningful friend in years. He was surrounded by people, but utterly alone. The Louisiana Hayride booking was supposed to be nostalgic, a return to his roots. Back in 1954, this very stage had launched his career when he was just a 19-year-old kid with greasy hair and a borrowed guitar. The Hayride had been his launching pad to stardom, the place where he'd first felt the electric connection between performer and audience. But returning to Shreveport in 1976 felt more like visiting a graveyard than a birthplace. That innocent kid who'd first stepped onto this stage was dead, buried under 20 years of fame, money, and the crushing realization that everything he'd gained had cost him the only things that really mattered. Elvis arrived in Shreveport 3 days before the show, checking into the same hotel where he'd stayed as a young performer. But instead of excitement, he felt hollow. His entourage noticed he was quieter than usual, spending hours staring out hotel room windows, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. What they didn't know was that Elvis had been having the dreams again, the same recurring nightmare that had plagued him since childhood. His twin brother Jesse, alive and growing up parallel to his life, but better. In the dreams, Jesse had a normal family, children who actually knew him, a wife who loved the man instead of the myth. Jesse lived the life that Elvis's fame had made impossible. The dreams were getting more frequent, more vivid. Sometimes Elvis would wake up confused about which brother he was supposed to be. Meanwhile, across the street from the municipal auditorium, 8-year-old Sarah Bate Morgan was fighting a battle that made Elvis's problems seem trivial by comparison. Sarah Bate had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia when she was 6 years old. For 2 years, she'd endured chemotherapy treatments that left her tiny body weak and her blonde hair falling out in clumps. The doctors had given her 6 months to live. That was 18 months ago. But Sarah Bate had something that kept her fighting: Elvis Presley's music. Her mother, Linda Morgan, worked double shifts as a waitress to pay for medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Sarah Bate's father had walked out 3 months after the diagnosis, unable to handle watching his daughter waste away. He left behind a collection of Elvis records and a letter saying he'd contact them when things got better. Things never got better. In her hospital room on the pediatric oncology ward, Sarah Bate had created a shrine to Elvis. Posters covered the sterile walls. She owned every album, every single, had memorized every song. When the pain from treatments became unbearable, nurses would find her humming "Love Me Tender" or "Can't Help Falling in Love," her small voice barely audible but perfectly in tune. The hospital staff had grown to love Sarah Bate's gentle spirit and fierce determination. Dr. Margaret Chen, her oncologist, later recalled that Sarah Bate never complained about the pain, never asked, "Why me?" Instead, she talked about Elvis like he was a family member. "My Elvis is performing tonight," she'd say on days when she felt strong enough to walk to the window. "I can feel it." On December 12th, Sarah Bate's condition had taken a turn for the worse. Her white blood cell count was dangerously low, and her body was shutting down. Dr. Chen had quietly advised the nursing staff that this might be Sarah Bate's last week. But Sarah Bate had overheard conversations between nurses about Elvis performing across the street at the Louisiana hayride. She'd begged, literally begged on her knees despite her weakness, for someone to help her see the show. Hospital policy strictly forbade patients from leaving their rooms after 8 p.m., especially terminal patients in Sarah Bate's condition. That's when night nurse Patricia Williams made a decision that would change everything. Patricia had been working pediatric oncology for 15 years. She'd watched too many children die, had held too many small hands as they slipped away from pain-filled lives. If Sarah Bate wanted to see Elvis Presley, Patricia was going to make it happen, rules be damned. At 9:30 p.m., while Elvis was taking the stage across the street, Patricia wheeled Sarah Bate's IV stand onto the small balcony outside the pediatric ward. Sarah Bate weighed only 47 pounds, her body ravaged by 2 years of aggressive treatment, but her eyes lit up with joy when she heard Elvis's voice carrying across the December night. "He sounds just like the records, Miss Patricia," Sarah Bate whispered, her voice barely strong enough to carry. "But sadder somehow, like he's hurting inside." Patricia would later say that Sarah Bate seemed to understand something about Elvis that the adults missed. While the audience cheered for the legend, Sarah Bate was listening for the man underneath. And when Elvis began singing "Love Me Tender," Sarah Bate's absolute favorite song, something magical and heartbreaking happened. Sarah Bate began singing along, but she wasn't singing the words everyone else knew. Instead of "Love Me Tender, Love Me Sweet," Sarah Bate's weak voice whispered into the night, "I love you, Elvis, I love you true." She was singing to him like he was her father, like he was the daddy who'd abandoned her when cancer made her imperfect, like he was the family she'd never really had. And somehow, impossibly, across the street, and over the sound of 3,000 cheering fans, Elvis Presley heard her. What happened next would destroy his career trajectory, but save his soul. The moment Elvis heard that tiny voice singing, "I love you, Elvis," instead of "Love Me Tender," everything inside him shattered. He stopped singing mid-verse. The band, confused by his sudden silence, stumbled to a halt. 3,000 people watched in bewilderment as Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, abandoned his performance and walked to the very edge of the stage. "Wait," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the theater's sound system. "Just wait." The audience thought this was part of the show. Some laughed nervously. Others checked their programs, wondering if this was some kind of new theatrical element. But those closest to the stage could see something in Elvis's face that had nothing to do with performance. This was raw, unguarded emotion. Elvis cupped his hands around his mouth and called across the street, "Sweetheart, what's your name?" From the hospital balcony, barely visible in the shadows, came a response so faint that only the December wind carried it back. "Sarah Bate." Sarah Bate, Elvis repeated, and his voice cracked slightly. That's a beautiful name, darling. How old are you? 8, came the whispered reply. The audience was growing restless now. Some were shouting for Elvis to continue the show. Others were standing up, trying to see what had captured his attention. Colonel Parker was frantically signaling from the wings, his face purple with rage. But Elvis ignored it all. Every instinct that had been trained into him over 20 years of performing, always give the audience what they want, never break character, the show must go on, all of it disappeared in the face of this child's need. 8 years old, Elvis said, and those who knew him well could hear something breaking in his voice. Sarah Bate, honey, why are you out there all alone? It's past your bedtime, isn't it? The response came back, carried on the night air. I'm sick, Elvis, but I wanted to see you before. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Elvis stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. The municipal auditorium had gone almost silent, except for scattered murmurs and the sound of December wind rattling the old building's windows. When Elvis spoke again, his voice was different, stripped of all performance, all pretense. This was just a man talking to a little girl. Before what, sweetheart? Before I go to heaven, Sarah Bate called back, her small voice somehow carrying across the impossible distance. The doctors say I might go soon, but I told them I had to see my Elvis first. Your Elvis? 2 words that hit Elvis Presley like a physical blow. Lisa Marie had never called him my daddy with that kind of love. Priscilla had never claimed him with that kind of pure devotion. But this dying child, this stranger he'd never met, had just called him hers with more genuine affection than he'd heard in years. The audience was getting agitated now. People were shouting, demanding the show continue. Someone yelled, "We paid to see Elvis, not to watch him talk to some kid." But Elvis didn't hear any of it. His entire world had narrowed to that small voice calling from the darkness. Sarah Bate, Elvis said, his voice growing stronger, more determined. What's your favorite song, honey? Love Me Tender, came the immediate reply. But I changed the words. I sing, I love you, Elvis, instead, because that's how I really feel. You're like the daddy I always wanted. And there it was, the words that would haunt Elvis for the rest of his life. This dying child had just told him exactly what he'd been desperate to hear from his own daughter. That he mattered. That he was loved not for his fame or his money or his talent, but simply because he existed. That someone, somewhere, saw him as a father figure worth loving. But more than that, Sarah Bate had revealed the crushing truth about his own failures. His real daughter was growing up feeling abandoned by a father too famous to be present, while this stranger's daughter was dying feeling abandoned by a father too cowardly to stay. Sarah Bate, Elvis said, and his voice was thick with emotion now. Is your mama there with you? She's working, Sarah Bate replied. She always works, but Miss Patricia is here. She's nice. Patricia Williams, watching from the balcony beside Sarah Bate, would later say that this was the moment she realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Elvis wasn't just making small talk with a fan. He was connecting with this child on a level that transcended performance, transcended the barrier between celebrity and civilian. Miss Patricia, Elvis called out, thank you for taking care of our girl. Our girl, Patricia felt tears streaming down her face. Elvis turned back toward the restless audience, but he wasn't seeing them anymore. In his mind, he was seeing every father who'd ever abandoned a sick child, every parent who'd chosen comfort over commitment, every man who'd walked away when love required sacrifice. He was seeing his own father, Vernon, who'd been physically present but emotionally absent throughout Elvis's childhood. He was seeing himself, so consumed with career obligations that he'd missed most of Lisa Marie's important moments. And he was seeing Sarah Bates' father, whoever he was, sleeping peacefully somewhere while his daughter prepared to die alone. Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis announced to the crowd, his voice steady now with newfound purpose. I need to make a very important house call. The audience erupted in confusion. House call? What was he talking about? Colonel Parker was frantically trying to get Elvis's attention, making throat-cutting gestures, mouthing the words contractual obligations and lawsuit. The band members looked at each other helplessly. The theater management was in full panic mode. But Elvis had made his decision. Sarah Bate, he called across to the hospital. I'm coming to see you right now. Don't you go anywhere, you hear me. From the balcony came a sound that cut through all the chaos and confusion, the pure, joyful laughter of a little girl who'd just been promised the impossible. "You can't leave the building," Colonel Parker hissed as Elvis walked past him toward the exit. "We have a contract. These people paid good money." Elvis stopped and looked at his manager, really looked at him, for the first time in years. In that moment, he saw clearly what the colonel had always been, a man who viewed human connections as interruptions to profit margins. "Colonel," Elvis said quietly, "there's a little girl over there who's dying. She called me her daddy. Now I'm going to go be the daddy she deserves, even if it's just for one night." "This will cost us a fortune in refunds and legal fees," Parker sputtered. Elvis smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "Good," he said. "Maybe it's time I spent my money on something that actually matters." And with that, Elvis Presley walked out on a paying audience for the first time in his career, leaving behind a theater full of confused fans and one very angry manager. But he was walking toward something far more important, a chance to be the father he'd always wanted to be, even if it was for someone else's child. The walk from the Municipal Auditorium to Shreveport Children's Hospital took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Elvis would remember that timing for the rest of his life, because those 4 minutes and 37 seconds represented the longest journey of his entire existence. Behind him, chaos erupted. 3,000 confused fans demanded explanations, refunds, something to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Colonel Parker was on 3 different phones simultaneously, trying to contain what he was already calling the biggest professional disaster of Elvis's career. The local police, thinking Elvis was having some kind of breakdown, followed at a respectful distance. His security team scrambled to keep up, radioing ahead to the hospital that Elvis Presley was incoming, and they had no idea why. But Elvis heard none of it. For the first time in decades, the noise of fame had been completely drowned out by something more powerful: purpose. As he approached the hospital's main entrance, Elvis could see Sarah Bates still on the balcony 3 floors up, a tiny silhouette against the window. She was waving at him with what looked like tremendous effort, and he could just make out her voice calling, "You really came, you really came." The hospital's night security guard, a middle-aged man named Robert Hayes, nearly had a heart attack when Elvis Presley walked through the front doors at 10:15 p.m. "Sir, Mr. Presley. Visiting hours ended at 9, and we don't usually." "I'm here to see Sarah Bate Morgan," Elvis said simply. "She's expecting me." Within minutes, the hospital was in controlled chaos. Dr. Margaret Chen was called from her home. The head of nursing arrived still in her bathrobe. Word spread through the hospital staff like wildfire. Elvis Presley was here, and he was asking to visit the little girl in pediatric oncology who'd been singing his songs for 2 years. But getting to Sarah Bate wasn't going to be simple. Hospital policy strictly prohibited after-hours visits, especially to the pediatric oncology ward. Insurance liability, patient safety protocols. A dozen different regulations stood between Elvis and that little girl. Dr. Chen arrived 20 minutes later to find Elvis sitting quietly in the hospital lobby, still wearing his stage clothes, a white jumpsuit that sparkled under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by nervous administrators trying to explain why this visit was impossible. "Mr. Presley," Dr. Chen said carefully, "I understand you want to see Sarah Bate, but she's in a very delicate condition right now. Her immune system is compromised, and any exposure to outside germs could be dangerous." Elvis looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much pain. "Doctor, that little girl is dying, isn't she?" Dr. Chen hesitated, then nodded slowly. "And she's dying alone, because her daddy walked out when she got sick." Another nod. "Well," Elvis said, standing up slowly, "I may not be her real daddy, but I'm here now, and sometimes being there is all that matters." The simplicity of his words, the quiet dignity in his voice, cut through all the medical protocols and administrative concerns. Dr. Chen looked at this man, this legend who could have been anywhere in the world, doing anything, earning thousands of dollars per minute, and realized he was willing to risk everything just to keep a promise to a dying child. "Follow me," she said quietly. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor was silent, except for the mechanical hum of the hospital machinery. Elvis stared at his reflection in the polished steel doors and saw a man he barely recognized. When had he become so hollow? When had his own eyes started to look as tired as his father's had in those final years? Sarah Bates' room was at the end of a long hallway painted in cheerful colors that couldn't quite mask the smell of disinfectant and sorrow. As they approached, Elvis could hear her voice, weak but determined, singing Love Me Tender with her modified lyrics. I love you, Elvis, I love you true. Dr. Chen knocked softly. Sarah Bate, you have a very special visitor. The singing stopped. A small voice, breathless with excitement and disbelief, called out, Is it really him? Elvis stepped into the doorway, and Sarah Bates' gasp of pure joy was audible throughout the pediatric ward. She was so much smaller than he'd imagined. Tiny and pale, with large eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than any 8-year-old should possess. Her head was covered with a colorful scarf, but Elvis could see the edges where chemotherapy had stolen her hair. IV tubes ran from her thin arms to machines that beeped and hummed constantly. But when she smiled at him, Sarah Bate Morgan lit up that sterile room like sunshine. You really came, she whispered. I knew you would. I told everyone you would, but they said famous people don't visit regular kids like me. Elvis walked slowly to her bedside, fighting back tears. Sarah Bates, sweetheart, there is nothing regular about you. You're the most extraordinary person I've met in a very long time. And then, without any fanfare or announcement, Elvis did something he hadn't done in years. He sat down beside her bed and simply talked, not as Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, not as a performer or a celebrity or a brand, just as a man talking to a little girl who needed someone to care. They talked about music, about her favorite songs, about why she'd changed the words to Love Me Tender. Sarah Bate told him about her mama working double shifts, about the daddy who'd left, about the other kids in the hospital who were fighting their own battles. Sometimes I pretend you're my daddy, she admitted shyly. When the treatments hurt real bad, I pretend you're here singing to me. It makes the pain go away. That's when Elvis reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that would shock even those closest to him. It was a ring, not just any ring, but his mother's ring. The simple gold band that Gladys Presley had worn until the day she died. The ring Elvis had been saving to give to Lisa Marie when she turned 18. Sarah Bate, Elvis said softly, my mama gave me this ring before she went to heaven. She told me to give it to someone who needed to know they were loved. I think that someone is you. Sarah Bates' eyes widened as Elvis gently slipped the ring onto her tiny finger. It was far too big, but she closed her fist around it like it was the most precious treasure in the world. Now you'll always have a piece of my family with you, Elvis whispered, and that makes you my little girl no matter what happens. What happened next would stay private for decades, known only to the nurses who witnessed it through the doorway. Elvis Presley, the man who'd entertained millions, spent the next 3 hours entertaining an audience of one. He sang lullabies. He told stories about Graceland, about his own childhood, about his mama's love that had never failed him. And for the first time since Priscilla had left, Elvis felt like he was exactly where he belonged. But outside that hospital room, the consequences of his decision were mounting. Colonel Parker was threatening lawsuits. The theater was demanding compensation for the abandoned show. The media was already spinning stories about Elvis's latest breakdown. By morning, this night would cost Elvis $250,000 in refunds and legal fees. It would damage his relationship with his manager beyond repair. It would make headlines as another example of his erratic behavior. Elvis didn't care about any of it. For the first time in years, he'd chosen love over money, human connection over career obligations. And in that choice, something inside him began to heal. Elvis visited Sarah Bate 6 more times in the 3 weeks that followed. Each visit was kept strictly secret from the media, but the hospital staff witnessed something extraordinary, the transformation of both a dying child and a broken man. On his second visit, Elvis brought something that shocked everyone who knew him. He brought Lisa Marie. It was December 19th, 1 week after that first night, when Elvis walked into Shreveport Children's Hospital holding his daughter's hand. Lisa Marie was 9 years old, just 1 year older than Sarah Bate, but she'd lived in a world of privilege that had shielded her from real suffering. Daddy, why are we here? Lisa Marie asked as they rode the elevator to the pediatric oncology ward. We're here to meet someone very special, Elvis said quietly. Someone who's going to teach us both something important about love. What happened in Sarah Bates' room that day would change Lisa Marie Presley's life forever. She watched her father, this man she'd always seen as distant and consumed with fame, become tender and present in a way she'd never experienced. She saw him sing lullabies to a dying child with more emotion than he'd ever brought to any stage performance. But more importantly, Lisa Marie saw something in Sarah Bates that broke her heart wide open. Here was a girl her own age who had nothing, no hair, no father, no future, but who radiated more joy and gratitude than anyone Lisa Marie had ever met. "Your daddy is the best daddy in the whole world," Sarah Bates told Lisa Marie that day, her thin hand still clutching Gladys's ring. "You're so lucky to have him." Lisa Marie, who had spent years feeling like an inconvenience in her father's life, suddenly saw him through Sarah Bates' eyes. Not as Elvis Presley the celebrity, but as a man capable of extraordinary love and sacrifice. From that day forward, something shifted between Elvis and Lisa Marie. The awkward distance that had defined their relationship began to dissolve. They started talking, really talking, about things that mattered, about loss and love and what it means to be family. Years later, Lisa Marie would say that Sarah Bates Morgan taught her how to love her father by showing her what it looked like to receive his love completely, and without reservation. But Sarah Bates' influence on Elvis went even deeper than healing his relationship with his daughter. She awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a desire to use his fame for something meaningful beyond entertainment. On December 27th, Elvis made his fifth visit to Sarah Bates. She was weaker now, the cancer progressing despite the doctor's best efforts. But she was still singing, still fighting, still lighting up that sterile room with her smile. "Elvis," she whispered that day, her voice barely audible, "when I go to heaven, will you visit the other kids here? They don't have anybody either." That simple request would reshape the final year of Elvis's life. Without any publicity or fanfare, Elvis began making regular visits to children's hospitals across the South. He'd show up unannounced, spend hours with terminal patients, sing lullabies to children who would never see their next birthday. The hospital staff were sworn to secrecy. Elvis insisted that these visits remain private. But more than that, Elvis began making changes to his business practices that reflected Sarah Bates' influence. He quietly began paying medical bills for families who couldn't afford treatment. He established a trust fund for terminal children at Shreveport Children's Hospital. He started turning down lucrative concert dates if they conflicted with his hospital visits. Colonel Parker was furious about these distractions, but Elvis no longer cared about the Colonel's approval. Sarah Bates had shown him what really mattered, and it wasn't record sales or box office receipts. On January 4th, 1977, Elvis made his final visit to Sarah Bates Morgan. She was dying. The doctors had moved her to a private room and told her mother, Linda, that it was time to say goodbye. Linda had called the hospital frantically, asking if someone could contact Elvis, but the staff didn't know how to reach him. They didn't need to. Elvis showed up at 6 p.m. that evening as if he'd somehow known. What happened in that room during Sarah Bates' final hours remained private for decades. But Patricia Williams, the nurse who had first taken Sarah Bates to the balcony, witnessed something she would never forget. Elvis sat beside Sarah Bates' bed and sang "Peace in the Valley" so softly that only she could hear it. He held her tiny hand while she slipped in and out of consciousness, whispering stories about heaven and how his mama would be there to welcome her. At 11:47 p.m., Sarah Bates Morgan died holding Gladys Presley's ring, with Elvis singing her to sleep one final time. The funeral was small, just Linda, a few hospital staff members, and Elvis Presley sitting quietly in the back row, wearing sunglasses to hide his tears. He paid for everything, the casket, the flowers, the burial plot. But more importantly, he kept a promise he'd made to Sarah Bates in those final moments. He would never abandon her memory. After Elvis's own death 8 months later, Linda Morgan revealed secrets that shocked the world. Elvis had been paying Sarah Bates' medical bills from that very first night. He'd set up a college fund for other children in the pediatric ward. He'd been visiting terminal patients at hospitals across the country, always in secret, always without publicity. But the most shocking revelation came when Linda shared a conversation she'd had with Elvis just days before Sarah Bates died. "Mr. Presley asked me if he could adopt Sarah Bates legally," Linda revealed. "He wanted to give her his name before she passed away, He said every child deserved to belong to someone who loved them completely. The adoption papers were being processed when Sarah Bate died. For a few brief days, she would have legally been Sarah Bate Presley. Elvis's final recordings, made in the months after Sarah Bates' death, carry her influence in every note. Songs like My Boy and He'll Have to Go were filled with the pain and love of a man who had learned what it truly meant to be a father, not through biology, but through choice and sacrifice. The trust fund Elvis established at Shreveport Children's Hospital still operates today, 47 years later. It's helped thousands of terminal children and their families, though few people know its origins trace back to a December night when a dying little girl whispered, "I love you," to a broken man who needed to hear those words more than he needed fame or fortune. Sarah Bate Morgan lived for 8 years, 3 months, and 12 days. But in her final 3 weeks, she accomplished something extraordinary. She saved Elvis Presley's soul by teaching him that love isn't about being loved. It's about choosing to love completely, even when it costs you everything. The last entry in Elvis's personal journal, written just weeks before his own death, contained only 4 words. "Thank you, Sarah Bate." She had given him the one thing his fame never could, the chance to be the father he'd always wanted to be. This story reveals the Elvis the world never knew, not the king of rock and roll, but a broken man who found redemption through a dying child's love. Sarah Bate Morgan showed Elvis that true greatness isn't measured in record sales or sold-out concerts, but in the lives you touch when no one is watching. Her 3 weeks with Elvis transformed not just his final year, but created a legacy of compassion that continues today. What do you think drove Elvis to risk everything for one small girl? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more untold stories that reveal the real man behind the legend.